Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Children's Health webinar. I think it's time to get started here. My name is Chloe Schwabe, and I direct the Environmental Health Initiative here at the National Council of Churches. And the National Council of Churches represents the 37 Protestant denominations, historic Black churches, and Orthodox churches in America. We are roughly 45 million people across the country and 100,000 congregations. And the NCC Eco-Justice Program has been around for nearly 30 years, starting with fighting acid rain, and now today we work on a number of issues, including climate change, biodiversity, and environmental health. So thank you again for joining us. Before I jump into sharing with you about our great speakers that we have on hand, I first want to just tell you a little bit about why this is an issue of faith and what our faith traditions have to teach us about this issue. In the Jewish tradition, we recognize the inherent value of children in future generations, and not only do we see it in Shabbat, but we also see it in the Old Testament when God makes a covenant with Noah and they commit to protecting the world for future generations to come. And then we also see it in the New Testament where Jesus speaks about children as being sacred beings and chastises, in a sense, his disciples when they try to make the children go away, and he brings them actually closer to him and tells them that they are sacred. And then also in other traditions, we also see how children's health and children are important. In general, in Buddhism, we know that there's call for compassion, as well as in Hinduism, for the society's most vulnerable members, and of course children are among the most vulnerable. And in Islam, we also see that there are a number of references to the importance of children. Muhammad expressed great love for children and compassion for children, and he would blow kisses to them in the streets and carry children on his shoulders. And we also see that there's a number of laws about how parents and children are in relationship with each other, and that children have the right to be protected and loved and cared for. So with that, that's a bit of an overview of why this is an issue of faith, and for the last 5 years, the National Council of Churches has been working to protect children from toxic chemical exposures that are linked to chronic diseases and other health concerns, ranging from birth defects to learning disabilities to early puberty in girls, and also childhood cancers and chronic diseases that develop later in life, such as diabetes and heart disease and Alzheimer's. And with that, I want to make sure to introduce our great speakers that we have. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Jerome A. Paulsen, and he is the Medical Director for National and Global Affairs at the Children's Health Advocacy Institute, and he is the Professor of Pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at the GW School of Public Health and Health Services. Dr. Paulsen is the Director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment, and it is one of 10 pediatric environmental health specialty units in the U.S. He is currently the chairman of the Executive Committee of the American Association of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health, and he also serves on the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and on the Technical Advisory Board for the Blacksmith Institute. And after Dr. Paulsen speaks, we are going to hear from Ms. Hester Paul. She has been the National Director of Eco-Healthy Childcare since February of 2008, and she is expanding the Eco-Healthy Childcare program so that children throughout the nation benefit from the reduction of harmful environmental toxics in child care facilities. Prior to working for Children's Environmental Health Network, Ms. Paul managed the nationalization of the Eco-Healthy Child Care Program for Oregon Environmental Council, and OECE is based in Portland, Oregon, and originated the Eco-Healthy Child Care Program in 2005. Hester has also served as the Director of Provider Services at the Child Care Resource and Referral Agency at the Children's Council of San Francisco. She has managed other programs such as Child Care Inclusion Challenge Project, a 4-organization collaboration in San Francisco which supports the successful inclusion of children with special needs in child care settings. Hester has an MS in clinical psychology from the University of South Alabama. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Paulsen.
The Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment is indirectly funded by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry and EPA, and they do not pre-review anything that I say or tell me what to say, and perhaps disagree with some of the things that I have to say. So I hope that by the time we finish this segment, you will be able to appreciate the differences between children and adults. And we all know intuitively that there are differences, but what those differences mean in terms of thinking about toxic substances in the environment that may impact on the health of kids, and different approaches that need to be taken if we're going to protect children than we might take if we are going to protect adults. So to start off and reinforce that notion that children are not little adults, let me just point out that they drink more water per pound of body weight, breathe more air per pound of body weight, and eat more food per pound of body weight than an adult does. And so if that water, air, or food is contaminated, then the children will get a higher dose of the contaminant on a per pound of body weight basis than will an adult. And another thing that's extremely important to recognize is that kids have a longer shelf life than adults do. They live longer than we do. If I'm exposed today, you all can't see me, but trust me, if I'm exposed to something today and it takes 60 years for there to be an adverse outcome, I hope I'm around, but not very likely. But if a kid is exposed to something today and it takes 60 years for an adverse outcome, they may very well be around, and we need to keep that in mind. When we think about exposures to toxic chemicals or other toxicants, ultraviolet light, radiation, in addition to chemicals and things like that, we actually need to think about exposures that begin before conception, exposure to the woman who will become the mother, the father, the male who will become the father, and impacts of toxicants on the sperm or the egg that join together and obviously form the embryo and fetus. I think a lot of us are very familiar with the notion of things happening to a fetus in the uterus and having problems with birth defects from exposures to drugs or alcohol, things like that. But we also have to recognize that even when a child is born, that child is not finished, if you would say, and that as they go from infant to adolescent, their bodies are developing and changing in ways that can be influenced for the better or for the worse by environmental exposures. Again, think back to 30, 40 years ago and issues about like thalidomide and exposure to infants in utero, or we certainly know that women who drink to excess during pregnancy can have children with birth defects. So the notion of in utero exposure and the importance of the timing of that exposure is very clear. But timing is important even in other exposures. If we look at lead, lead's a toxicant for adults, as well as for children, but the impact of lead on children is their central nervous system, their brain, and the impact of lead in adults is primarily their peripheral nervous system, the nerves that control the arms and legs, things like that. So it's the same toxicant, but different age of exposures means different outcome. Ultraviolet light's another example for Caucasian individuals. If they sustain 5 blistering sunburns before adulthood, their risk of developing malignant melanoma, which is the most serious form of skin cancer, is about 3 times higher than it would have been had they not been exposed to those blistering sunburns. If those blistering sunburns occur after about 2021, then the risk of developing malignant melanoma is not increased. So again, the same toxicant, ultraviolet light, exposure at a different time and a different outcome. And while we know something about what goes on in utero, and we know a little bit about what goes on at other points in early childhood, we know next to nothing about what goes on during adolescence, which is a time of great change in the human body, as I think we're all well aware. So let's just point out some other differences between kids and adults. In the uterus, children have a placenta, and obviously none of us adults still have our placenta anymore. If you look at textbooks from 30 or 40 years ago, the discussion was the placenta is a barrier that protects children in the uterus from exposure to harmful chemicals. And we realized that that concept is no longer true, that there are chemicals that must be transported across the placenta to the fetus and from the fetus out through the placenta to the mom in order for the child to be healthy and develop normally. And we also know that toxic chemicals like lead and alcohol and other things can pass across the placenta and into the child. We also know that the placenta at 3 months gestation is different than the placenta at, say, 9 months gestation right before. So it changes over time, and we know that for certain things like heat or noise or radiation, the placenta really plays no role at all in changing how those toxicants may influence the fetus. While breast milk is the most important form of nutrition for children, it is an example of how we as the human species have fouled our own nest to point out that breast milk contains toxicants. Every human being on the face of this earth has fat-soluble toxins like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, or dioxins, or DDT, the old pesticide that's still used some places on earth, in our fat. But women who breastfeed move those fat-soluble chemicals from their bodies into the breast milk and then into their children. Women can also move some metals from their body into their children, and if they're drinking or smoking while they're breastfeeding, they can move cotinine, nicotine, or alcohol into their children. Everybody who's raised a child, everybody who's been around a child, knows that little kids don't eat like adults do. But there's actually studies that document this in some detail. And so if you look at this table in front of you and look where I've put the red circles, this looks at apple consumption for kids less than 1 year of age and adults 40 to 69 years of age. And children, because of all the applesauce that they eat in the first year of life, on average consume about 5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of apples, whereas adults only consume about 0.4 grams. So if you're trying to protect the population as a whole from contaminants that may occur in apples, and you think about an adult and then assume that the person is going to eat 0.4 grams of apples per kilogram of body weight per day, then obviously you're not going to protect the kids less than a year who eat over 10 times that amount of apples per day. And even looking in the next table at drinking water, little kids drink about twice the amount of water per day that an adult does. And so again, that gets back to what I said at the outset, that if that water is contaminated, the children are going to get a higher dose of the contaminant than the adult will. When the brain starts to form in the fetus, it's not finished until perhaps 21, 22, maybe even 25 years of age. And in order for the brain to develop normally, cells have to move. There's cellular migration. They have to move from one place to another. And then they have to form connections between different nerve cells, and that's called synaptogenesis. And if you've ever looked at an electrical cord or a telephone wire, they have that rubber insulation around them. Well, myelin is essentially the insulation that goes around the nerve cells, because the nerve cells work on electrical impulses, and so they need to be insulated just the way electrical or telephone cords are insulated. And the process of putting that myelin on the nerve cells is called myelination. For the brain to be normal, some cells are needed at some point in time, and then they must die in order for the brain to be normal later on. And that process is known as apoptosis. And then within the brain, and to some extent within other parts of the body, there is a limited ability to repair or regenerate if injuries happen. Well, this migration, this movement of cells, this formation of synapses, the myelination, all of these steps are very exquisitely timed. And if something interferes with step C, then D and E and G and H can't happen normally. And once it's past the time for a step to have occurred, you can't go back and redo it. So that's why the development of the brain is so susceptible to even mild insults from chemicals or other toxic substances. The lungs continue to grow. We think of the windpipe, the trachea in the neck, and then that branches into the right and left lung and continues to branch like the branches of a tree. And then at the end of those branches of the tree are the alveoli, similar to the leaves, I guess, where the oxygen actually goes into the blood and the carbon dioxide goes out. And that bronchial tree continues to grow throughout childhood, and new alveoli that are developed throughout childhood. And we know, for example, that kids who grow up in regions of the country with higher air pollution will, when they are young adults, have smaller lungs than those who grew up in areas that had less air pollution. Their lungs are not so much smaller that they are symptomatic from that difference, but what Ms. Schwabe was talking about before in terms of adult onset problems from childhood exposures. So if at 20 your lungs are smaller than somebody else, what happens when you're 60? Are you more likely to have some kind of pulmonary disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is also known as emphysema, for example? We don't know that for sure, but there's certainly reason to be concerned. The endocrine system is all of the so-called glands in the body. I think some of us are familiar with the pituitary or the thyroid or the adrenal glands, but there are other glands, as you can see on this diagram in this slide. And the endocrine system is a system of carrying information from one part of the body to another, not by electrical impulses as happens in the nervous system, but really by chemical messengers. Chemical is released from the pituitary gland, goes into the bloodstream and influences the thyroid gland, or chemicals released from the adrenal glands goes into the circulation, influences the heart, et cetera, et cetera. And we are finding that many, many, many chemicals have the potential to disrupt this endocrine system. And we know that the endocrine system is extremely important in the development of secondary sexual characteristics, the ability to become pregnant and all that sort of thing, and that it's different in males and females. Other differences, even with adolescents, of course, by then some adolescents are drinking and smoking, some may be experimenting with recreational drugs, some may have begun to use oral contraceptives or steroids for, they think, enhancing their athletic performance. Doesn't really do that. And adolescents, as opposed to younger kids, can just go into the store and buy, aspirin or cold medicine or anything like that. And we have to take those behavioral differences into account as well. If you've got little kids in the room where you are right now, they probably aren't sitting in a chair like you are. They're probably crawling around on the floor. So that means that their exposure to that same environment, that same room that they may be in with you, is actually different than your exposure is. If there's something on the floor and they're crawling around and putting their hands in it and then putting their hands in their mouth, they're exposed to that dust from a pesticide or dust from a flame retardant or lead or something like that. Whereas when you walk across it in your shoes, and then presumably don't put your shoes in your mouth, you're not going to be exposed. Kids are shorter than adults, so if there's something like exhaust coming out from a bus and an adult and a child are walking down the street and that exhaust pipe is at 3 feet off the ground, the kids are going to be more exposed to that exhaust than the adult will. We want kids to run. We've got an epidemic of obesity in this country. But, of course, when kids run, they breathe more, and if the air they're breathing is polluted, they get a bigger dose of that pollutant. Sometimes parents work at home or bring toxins home from work, and we have to think about kids' exposure to workplace toxins, even though they're home. And then, of course, when adolescents go out into the workforce, they can be exposed to workplace toxins. Dose does make a difference, but dose is not the only thing that makes a difference, and it is not always the case that the higher the dose, the worse the outcome. There are some, particularly of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, that lower doses may have more impact than some higher doses. The length of time of the exposure, is it very brief, or does it go on, like, for example, with lead or air pollutants, where it goes on for years? There may be differences between individual human beings on a genetic basis that influence their susceptibility. And even in the United States and certainly overseas, there are differences in exposure that are based on cultural patterns, boy children and girl children doing different things, men and women doing different things. Wherever you go in this world, if you are poor or if you are of a minority racial or ethnic status, you will be more exposed to toxicants than if you are not poor or if you are not of a minority racial or ethnic status. In other countries, the poorest of the poor actually live in the waste dumps. And while as far as I know, that doesn't occur here in the United States, certainly those who are poor are more likely to live close to hazardous waste sites, trash transfer stations, bus barns, and other sites where they are more likely to be exposed to environmental health hazards. There is essentially no testing of chemicals before they go onto the market unless they are drugs or pesticides. So we don't know very much about the impact of most chemicals that are in the environment on kids. And while we know something about lead or arsenic or some other individual chemicals, it's very unusual, if not impossible, for any human being to be exposed to one thing at a time. We are exposed to, if we're walking around outside, ultraviolet light, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, et cetera, and what we really have to know is how those things interact. Does one thing protect us from another? Does one thing make something worse? And the research to do that is extremely difficult. So while Ms. Paul is going to talk about some of the specific chemicals, and I may chime in from time to time, I did want to let you know about a resource that's available to anyone in the United States when they have questions about children's health and the environment, and those are the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Units. Anybody, pediatrician, parent, public health official, nurse, school teacher can call a Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit at no charge and get an answer to a question that relates children, health, and the environment. And this is a list of some of the kinds of problems that we deal with. It's not at all an exhaustive list. Things that are common, like lead poisoning, but things that may be less common and aren't on this list, we can deal with as well. As I mentioned, we are indirectly funded by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry and EPA. The money goes through a non-governmental organization called the Association of Occupational and Environmental Clinics. And there is a Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit in each of the 10 regions of the country. My unit serves Region 3, but again, if you take a quick look at this map, you'll see that there is a region available to any of you around the country. And if you go to www.tehsu.net, you can find the list of all of the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Units, their contact information, as well as some information material that the PEDS units have put on the web for people to access. And so I will now turn this over to Hester Paul, and then we will come back and be able to answer questions. Thank you all very much.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Jerry. So as Dr. Paulsen said, there are numerous possible ways that a child could be exposed to environmental health toxics or hazards within the child care setting, whether it be center-based or family child care-based. And so what we did is just chose 3 categories as we have limited time today. So I'll be going over pesticides and then household cleaners or chemicals, and then talking about plastics. And I just wanted to say early on that there's a lot more that we could be saying, but we just kind of wanted to give you an overview of the health concerns related to these environmental health hazards and things that you can do alternatively so that you can realize, all right, it might be scary to have children be exposed to these chemicals, but there is always something that we can be alternatively doing to reduce their exposure. So starting with pesticides, we know pesticides are poison. If you just think about what you're trying to do with the pesticide or herbicide or insecticide or fungicide, these are chemicals that are designed to kill or repel insects, plants, funguses, or other unwanted organisms. And so if you are using a chemical that is designed to kill such organism as we just described, then it's not too far-fetched to think that if you have a young child who's crawling around on the floor, rolling around on the floor, and they're, let's say, 2.5 or younger, then they very likely are going to have a negative reaction or much worse to exposure to one of these chemicals designed to just repel, let's say, a plant or a spider. We know pesticides are widely used not only in agriculture and forestry, but also on roadsides and in golf courses, as well as in schools, hospitals, parks, homes, gardens. They're used very pervasively. We know that right now more than half of all U.S. households, an estimated of 58 million households, use insecticides at home. And probably just thinking about your own personal lives, you've probably used them at home before. You may have used them within your own schools. We know that they often linger for a long time inside buildings and inside our bodies, so we really want to think about it's not just the time that you use it, but it's also the length that it kind of lingers in the air and we continue to breathe it. And it might not just be lingering in the air, but it may settle down into the carpet that you have within your home or facility. And then if that child, again, is crawling or rolling around on that carpet, then invariably they are breathing a different air quality than we are, and they may be continually breathing some residues of that pesticide that was used even maybe years before. So that we know that pesticides' health effects don't always end with pests or weeds that they eliminate, but we know that from a growing body of research that we also have some associated pest exposure with serious health effects. So we know that pesticides are, people are exposed to pesticides by either absorbing them through the skin, inhaling pesticides in the air, as we described before, and consuming foods that may have pesticides used on them. So we'll talk about that a little more. And we know that children may be exposed to pesticides, as we said before, by either playing on floors, maybe they're playing out in the yard where pesticides were used, or by even handling pets. So that's something people commonly don't think about. But if you're playing around with a dog or cat that maybe has been treated for fleas, that is another form of pesticides that then the child would be either breathing in or maybe touching the animal and then potentially eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich before they wash their hands, and that way they have exposure as well. Let's see here. And I'm going to flip to the next slide here. So we know that the pesticide health effects, these are just a few examples. We know, like Jerry said, that we're not just looking at exposure to the child when they're already born and moving around, but we're also looking at prenatal exposures. And research shows that children can be born with a smaller head circumference, a lower birth weight, sometimes a developmental delay, and sometimes a lower IQ. We know that acute exposure to high levels of pesticides can cause difficulty in breathing or chest tightness, vomiting, cramps, diarrhea, and then there's long-term exposure problems as well, such as often it can be hormone disruptors. So again, we're talking about things like endocrine disruptors or stuff that has to do with reproductive damage. So it might be undescended testes, lower sperm counts, maybe problems getting pregnant later on in life, or potentially some miscarriages. We also know that pesticides are often the cause of acute poisonings, particularly for children younger than 6. And we have several studies that are implicating pesticides as a cause for chronic diseases, such as childhood leukemia and other cancers, and also Parkinson's disease. So we're seeing that there are some short-term exposure problems. There's also long-term exposure problems, and we see, as Jerry said, it's not just when you're exposed, but it's the length of exposure, it's how much you're exposed to, it's your genetic background, and it also is other factors that we're still learning about. So what can we do alternatively? We know now that pesticides are a scary thing. The main thing we want to leave you with today is that integrated pest management is something that is a system, if you will, of trying to get rid of pests or repel pests without using chemicals as a first resort. So as a very last resort, if you have tried all of these other mechanisms, such as fixing leaky taps so that you're reducing water exposure for those insects or rodents, if you've caulked cracks, you're trying to figure out where are those ants coming in, where are those cockroaches coming in, you're being a little bit of a detective, and maybe you're making sure that everything is super clean. Fundamentally, we know that pests are needing exactly what an adult human needs or a child needs to survive. So they want food, they want water, and they want shelter. So if you are providing those things for a pest, then it's not shocking that they're trying to come in and live within your child care facility or your home. So integrated pest management, you might have heard of the acronym IPM, is a system where we are trying to get rid of pests without using chemicals as a first resort. So again, it could be used as a last resort, but if we are using chemicals, as we'll see in the next slide, then we really want to make sure that we are using a professional when we can to lay down the chemical or the pesticide, and also to be using it in a time when there's going to be least exposure to a child. So, for example, if you are hiring a professional, you might hire them on a Friday afternoon and hope then that there's at least a 48-hour window before children are coming in again on that next Monday. So we know, I think it's important to just kind of share the Environmental Protection Agency description of IPM. We know that it's not a single pest control method, but rather a series of pest management evaluations, decisions, and controls. So you're really kind of becoming that detective, like I mentioned before, figuring out how the pest is getting in and then trying to use alternative measures. So there are usually 4 different steps in IPM, and just going over them briefly, you want to set a pest threshold. So you kind of want to figure out what is the proper amount of pests. Can you handle a few ants walking around on your counter, or is that really setting you to the limit of needing some extreme measure of using chemicals? But there might be a certain amount of pests that you can actually deal with where you know that they're not harming a child. Second thing is determining why pests are in undesirable areas and trying to prevent them from being there. So as we said, you want to be a detective and find out, are they in your kitchen because there's leftover crumbs? Are they coming into maybe your garage because there's some standing water? So you're just trying to figure out why the pests are there. Let's see here. I'm going to keep moving because I know our time is a little bit limited. So what can you do alternatively to try to reduce your pests besides using IPM? One of the main things we can do is make sure that we're always washing our fruits and vegetables under running water. We want to serve organic foods when possible. Again, we are very aware that organic foods can be very expensive, but if you do have that flexibility within your budget, then it's really important to try to choose fruits and vegetables that have the highest pesticide residues. That's what you'd want to choose to be your organic fruits. We want to hire a professional if we have found that we've tried all of these other strategies to try to get rid of pests and they're not working. Then you want to hire a professional, somebody who's certified to be a specialist with using hopefully the least toxic kind of pesticides that they can find. You want to apply only when the children aren't around. You always want to use something like baits or traps. You want something to be standing. You never want to be using anything that's being sprayed. And again, that's because children are breathing that in. You want to use something that is a standing trap. That'd be much preferable. And you're making sure that they're always in spaces that children don't have access to. You want to make sure that these are always properly labeled and stored away from children in a child-proof container. Always following directions, and again, using your own safety factor. So I would say at least a 48-hour window between application or putting the trap out and then collecting that trap maybe 2 days later. So again, we know that we want to make sure you wash your produce prior to eating. I'm sure many of you guys already do that. And again, you want to be choosing this fruit when possible with the highest exposure. So in this slide, I'm sorry, is someone moving these slides for me? Let me move. I'm sorry, let's see here. Okay, so in this slide we're seeing that you have the Dirty Dozen and you have the Clean 15. And so you would want to be choosing the if you can only afford to choose certain fruits and vegetables, then you want to be choosing those that are known to have the highest pesticide exposure. And so that would be this Dirty Dozen. You can find this on foodnews.org. And so, apples, celery, strawberries, peaches, these are items that are known to have high pesticide residues. So you'd want to be choosing those if you're choosing organic. Okay, so moving on to household chemicals here. We know that obviously there's a lot to be cleaning up within child care. We know that there are big differences between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. Each state has different child care licensing regulations, which deems when you have to clean versus sanitize or disinfect. The differences very generally is that routine cleaning is going to be with detergent and water. It's going to be the most useful method for removing germs and dirt from surfaces. A sanitizer is not going to totally remove all microorganisms, but it is going to remove 99.9% of specific germs. We know a disinfectant is going to destroy or irreversibly inactivate microorganisms. So the first thing to do is make sure that you're following state licensing regulations for child care and using disinfectants and sanitizing only when you really have to. Otherwise, what we want to encourage is that you're cleaning when you have to and not necessarily jumping to using a sanitizer or disinfectant such as chlorine bleach. So the first thing we'd like to recommend is that you go onto these two websites, ecologo.org or greenseal.org, and these are biodegradable, mild cleaners that you can find on these websites. But inevitably, these are two third-party certifiers that kind of research all products for us, not all products, but many products for us to try to determine which cleaners, disinfectants, and sanitizers are biodegradable, if they're cleaners, and the healthiest for children to be around given our options. So if you're looking for a cleaner, you might go onto one of these websites and either key in a product that you already know to see if it's deemed appropriate, or you might just enter something like cleaning windows or cleaning carpets, and then a list of certified products that are eco-healthy would come up as options. As far as chlorine bleach, we know that chlorine bleach is great for sanitizing and disinfecting. The reason it's so popular is because it's easily accessible. We know that it works, it's very effective, and it's very cheap. So by all means, it's fine to be using chlorine bleach and water if it's used in the proper ratios as deemed appropriate by your child care licensing regulations. Another option is to be using EPA-certified disinfectants or sanitizers, and you can find those options on the Design for Environments website. If some people like to go ahead and make their own cleaning alternatives, and there are several recipes that we can key you into later, but those are recipes that are using baking soda, cornstarch, or lemon juice. Remember, though, those are for cleaning, so that would be an instance where you're trying to remove dirt, for example, from a table, and not where you're dealing with something like bodily fluids in which you'd need to use a disinfectant or sanitizer depending on what the bodily fluid is and where the exposure is. We know we always want to avoid anything that's flammable. We never want to be using any type of aerosol. It's always best to use something that can be directly applied and not sprayed, such as a wipe. And we want to make sure we're avoiding anything that's labeled as corrosive or something that could damage eyes or membranes. So the principles of cleaning for health, the main thing here is we want to keep the dirt out, and I'd say the main statement to walk away with is that clean really doesn't have a smell. And so we want to make sure, as we said, to use less toxic, third-party certified, all-purpose cleaners when we can, and you want to make sure that you are using sanitizers and disinfectants when you have to, only in targeted areas. Always making sure that you're updating and maintaining equipment, so you're kind of following that, making sure everything is labeled. And then when cleaning, the big thing is you want to make sure, or disinfecting or sanitizing, that you're properly ventilating. That would be a key point here to take home. You want to make sure that if you are able, you want to be opening windows, making sure they're screened to protect children from falling out. And if you can't open a window, let's say it's way too cold or way too hot, then you want to make sure you're really opening doors and using a fan so that you have a lot of ventilation going on to reduce just chemicals kind of lingering in the air. Always using protective gear, obviously, if you have it, the more the better, I would say, and always storing chemicals in their original container and out of sight of children. Just real quickly here about washing hands. We know that you always want to wash with regular soap and water, and that's the number one way to reduce the spread of germs. So you want to kind of have asking children to wash their hands as often as possible, but definitely before eating and definitely every time they come in from outside. They should be washing their hands for at least 15 seconds under their nails and between their fingers. And a cute way to tell them how long that is if they were singing the happy birthday song within their head. They could kind of remember, oh, it is kind of a long time to sit here and wash our hands. Moving on now to plastics and plastic toys. We know that there's tons of different types of toys out there. We totally appreciate that. But we want to just talk about a few of them here, just generally about plastics and plastic toys. We know that plastics are bad for the environment generally in the beginning and end of their life cycle. We know that the manufacturing creates air and water pollution, and it's also a big waste disposal burden. And you can just think yourselves of research that you've seen or maybe stories that you've heard of how long it might take, for example, for styrofoam to degrade in dirt. It takes forever. So we know that generally just the creation and the destruction of plastic can be bad for the environment. But generally what we want to talk about here with regard to children within child care is to always avoid toys made out of soft plastic vinyl. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but you can kind of think of that texture and smell of a rubber ducky or a baby doll's head where it's kind of that soft, pliable plastic. We always want to be looking for PVC or BPA-free labels. BPA is bisphenol A, and we're going to get into that in a minute. That's where you're seeing more of the hard types of plastic that we're seeing in sippy cups and baby bottles. But again, generally here, you never want to use any type of plastic in the microwave, no plastic wrap. I would say no microwave dinners that come in plastic. You don't want to heat anything in plastic at all. The reason for that is you are in a microwave, you're heating that plastic to a certain temperature that's basically allowing leaching of the chemicals of plastic into the food or drink within the container in the microwave, and then you're ingesting them if you're drinking or eating then the food that was warmed in that plastic. We want to know make sure you wash all the toys before using them at all. And if the toy has a recycling code, such as these shown here on the slide, then you want to make sure you are avoiding toys for children that have a 3 that would represent vinyl or PVC, which is polyvinyl chloride, and that's that soft, pliable plastic, or a number 7. 7 is kind of a catch-all category, but mainly we want to avoid 7 because it often represents bisphenol A or hard, clear plastics. So going quickly here through PVC, number 3 would be the recycling code that you would see potentially on the bottom of a toy, or it's something to look for. I think it's good to be knowledgeable about it, but it's also smart to know that these toys are not required to have the recycling code on them. So even though if you're aware to look for I don't want to buy any toys with a recycling code 3, very often that code's not going to be on there, so we need to know other things to look for. So this example here of the baby doll, again, if you were kind of trying to squeeze her face, it would be very flexible. When this toy is new, it has a very kind of strong odor. It smells very much like a new shower curtain that's made out of polyvinyl chloride. And this rubber ducky is a very good example, again, of this texture. The reason we want to avoid these toys is because they are made with, again, they are made with polyvinyl chloride, and within the polyvinyl chloride are a group of chemicals known as phthalates. And phthalates exposure to phthalates are related to endocrine disruption. As we stated before, that means potentially difficulty getting pregnant, miscarriages, undescended testes, low sperm counts, premature onset of puberty, as well as negative effects of the liver, kidney, spleen, and bone formation. So generally, we know that we want to try to stick with toys that are not soft, pliable plastic. Moving on now to bisphenol A. Again, that's the acronym you would have heard of is BPA. The recycling code number is number 7. But again, not everything is going to have the recycling code on it, and so what you want to do here is avoid, mainly in child care settings, you're going to see this in either sippy cups or bottles, or sometimes adult water containers or liquid containers, such as this Nalgene container. But if the plastic is very hard, you can't flex it, it's clear, those are 2 good, strong indications that it may have bisphenol A in it. It's very similar in how it affects the body, and that's that it's an estrogen mimicker, the actual chemicals. And so you want to obviously try to reduce exposure because the health effects are that research shows that it's linked to prostate cancer, breast cancer, miscarriages, again, a lot of endocrine disruption. And we know that it is very widespread. A Center of Disease Control study came out and said that people's exposures, about 93% of adults that were tested did have traces of BPA within their bodies, and we know that that's because it is used very pervasively, and if you didn't know not to avoid it, then you would see that probably in your own lifetimes you have been drinking out of some of these containers. So instead, we want you to try to use either glass containers that maybe have a silicone sleeve on them so that when dropped by a child they won't break, or you want to try to choose bottles that say BPA-free, which are very easy to find now in grocery stores and different types of stores for children's products. What you can do, though, is discard all food containers that are hard and clear and have scratches in them, and especially baby bottles and infant feeding cups, we would say. Temperature does matter. You want to make sure not to put any kind of boiling water or, infant formula or other liquids into BPA-containing bottles. Hopefully you're just going to get rid of them, but if you did keep them, you would absolutely not want to put anything super hot within them. The same reason is that as you put a super hot liquid into a BPA-containing bottle, you potentially have leaching of the chemicals in the plastic into the liquid that the child would then be ingesting. So let's say that you purchase, even if you purchase a BPA-free bottle, you want to make sure that you are warming whatever liquid you're going to give to the child in another, hopefully glass container, and then pouring it into the bottle when it's at a proper temperature for the child to be eating. We know that decreasing exposure is something that we can absolutely do, and it does show very quick results. And what we see from research is after 3 days of reducing exposure to BPA, for example, this is something I didn't mention either, but there's also BPA in the lining of cans, both soda and your canned food. Not all of them, but the majority. So if you can, you should be trying to serve and purchase fruits and vegetables or other foods that are either frozen or fresh, if possible. And so by eliminating the food that you're eating that's either canned or prepackaged within cans, and also only using glass or stainless steel, let's say food storage containers and cups and glasses, we know that you can greatly reduce your exposure to BPA. And that's all I have for today.
Great. Thank you so much, Hester and Dr. Paulsen, for sharing all this wonderful information. I want to open this up to questions, so I'm going to try to unmute everybody. So if you have a question, I think we're a small enough group that you can probably just put it out there, but you can also raise your hand, I think, somehow on this webinar. Does anyone have any questions? Do either of the presenters want to make any additional comments at this point?
Yeah, this is Hester. I would just say for the Eco-Healthy Childcare program, there are a lot of resources that we have where we have kind of tried to distill all of the research and information out there so that it's easily accessible. And on our website, it's cehn.org/EHCC. I'll just type it in here. On there, you can go to a section of fact sheets, and there are 16 fact sheets that have to do with 16 different environmental health hazard content areas, and from there you can understand kind of in a nutshell what the health concerns are related to a specific toxicant, and then also what you can be doing alternatively. And I wanted to apologize for not advancing my slides. I was looking at a separate PowerPoint while I was talking to you.
No problem. Well, if no one has any questions, then I just want to thank our presenters for making the time to share all this great information with us. And if anyone would like to follow up with me afterwards with any questions you might have, I'd be happy to direct them to either of our panelists, who I'm sure would be happy to get back to you. So thank you again to everyone for taking the time today to participate, and many blessings in your birth care ministries, and just appreciate everything you all are doing out there to care for God's creation and all the vulnerable people in our world.